There is no language in itself, nor are there any linguistic universals, only a throng of dialects, patois, slangs, and specialized languages. There is no ideal speaker-listener, any more than there is a homogeneous linguistic community. There is no mother tongue, only a power takeover by a dominant language within a political multiplicity.
Welcome to the Hyperpolyglot Activist, Learn Languages, Make a Difference. My name is Dr. Carlos Yebra Lopez, and today we're going to tackle exactly this expression, mother tongue. It's one that oftentimes we take for granted in society, but if we have a closer look at it, we'll realize that the so-called mother tongue is intractably linked to the birth of the modern nation state, and it privileges a certain bourgeois model of motherhood that excludes and oppresses many other ways of being in the world. Sounds interesting? Stay tuned.
Mother tongue and equivalent terms such as langue maternelle, Muttersprache, lingua materna, etc. all refer first and foremost to the learning that takes place within the family, which is first spontaneous and then programmed. However, the term mother tongue is not an empirical concept, hence the title of this video, but an ideological abstraction. Why? Well, contrary to what the quote-unquote mother tongue expression suggests, languages are not biological entities automatically transmitted from one generation to the next one. Rather, languages are socio-cultural constructs, so that speaking a language entails a long process of enculturation through a chain of transmission that is affected by a number of complex factors. To what extent is the mother present in the child's upbringing? What happens in cases where that child is raised by a couple that does not share the same primary language? What about situations where the primary milieu language is different from the dominant language in the household? How does migration affect the chain of transmission? Now let's break this down. First, the so-called mother tongue, i.e. the primary language, is not always that of the mother.
And this is particularly clear, for instance, in the case of the volume Beyond the Mother Tongue, the Postmonolingual Condition, authored by Yasemin, Gilles. In the introduction, pages 10 to 13, the author talks about the mother tongue as a linguistic family romance. And so she says the so-called mother tongue is the effective knot at the center of the monolingual paradigm and therefore a knot worth unraveling. This knot relies heavily on the invocation of the maternal, without, however, necessarily referencing actual mothers. As the discussion of Schleiermacher begins to illustrate, the mother in quote-unquote mother tongue stands in for the allegedly organic nature of this structure by supplying it with notions of maternal origin, affective and corporeal intimacy, and natural kinship. Yet the emotional and ideological connotations of mother tongue on which Schleiermacher draws and with which we are still familiar today are themselves historical artifacts and not transhistorical constants. So again, it's referring to the discursive nature of mother tongue. And this is very interesting. It says originally a Latin term, lingua materna was used in the Middle Ages and the early modern period to refer to lay people's vernaculars in contrast to learned Latin. Muttersprache first began to be an emotionalized term in the late 18th century, when it was newly linked to a notion of linguistic socialization, that is, at the same time as the monolingual paradigm took shape. So again, the notion of mother tongue is intractably linked to that of the monolingual paradigm. Now, Yildiz says, this change itself occurred in the context of larger social and political transformations that produced new and interrelated conceptions of family, kinship, motherhood, nation, and state. The family, for instance, only then began to be thought of as consisting solely of biological kin and excluding other members of the household, such as servants. This rethinking corresponded to the reorganization of labor and the household that resulted in a stricter separation of the private and public realms. So there's a reconfiguration of the family household that has to do with the currency that the notion mother tongue currently has in our society. The new context, says Yildiz, defined bourgeois motherhood increasingly as the site of affective care rather than simply physical care. It was this image of the bourgeois mother that entered into the modern, quote unquote, mother tongue discourse. And this is crucial. The mother tongue expression does not refer to just any mother, but it stems very specifically from a bourgeois model of motherhood that is intractably linked to a certain notion of nation. And here there's another volume that is key to understand this idea. Borrowed Tongues, Life Writing, Migration and Translation by Eva Karpinski. On page 183, this volume affirms the following. The name mother tongue is derived from the association of the child's acquisition of language through contact with the mother in the early years. However, a connection with children is broken and denied to slave mothers, indigenous mothers, working class mothers, and migrant mothers walking away from their families as part of the transnational circuit of cheap labor. Consequently, the concept of mother tongue must be seen as gendered, classed, and racialized through the white middle class ideology of motherhood, which romanticizes and essentializes the mother's role in the process of reproduction of exclusionary national identities. So there you go, as clear as it can be. Now, Gilles says that the ensuing constellation of mother and language continues to be a complicated one is demonstrated by the diverse perspective on it amongst contemporary feminists. So we can see different sides of feminism taking different perspectives on the notion of mother tongue, which is really interesting. Gilles says, some feminist critics celebrate the mother tongue as varying residues or traces of the maternal body. Feminists who view the mother tongue in this manner valorize it as the expression of the repressed and dominating maternal and set it against male authority. Yet, other feminists working within a psychoanalytical framework stress the divergence between the maternal and the linguistic. For instance, some readings align the maternal with the pre-Oedipal and pre-verbal. Developed in particular by Julia Kristeva, this vision sees the maternal as preceding language. Kristeva's proposed structure thus locates language and the law of the father as separate from the mother, who is pure bodily closeness. A third strand, which guides my approach, says Yildiz, rejects both of these utopian figurations of the mother. As feminist philosopher Rosi Braidotti puts it, Lacanian psychoanalysis shows us that there is no such thing as a mother tongue, that all tongues carry the name of the father and are stamped by its register. For Braidotti, mother does not stand for something outside the law of the father, but rather resides squarely within it. Nevertheless, the mother's body and all that it suggests about affection, proximity, and presence continues to function implicitly in the still active concept of the mother tongue. The complex imbrication of the mother's body with language and male authority is underscored by media theorist Friedrich Gilles' historical account of the turn to phonetics in literacy education. Around 1800, the bourgeois mother began to be incorporated into the role of teaching her children to read. Kittler demonstrates in great detail how the mother's mouth became the central conduit in the production of proper sounds in the mother tongue. The child was supposed to see and hear the mother's mouth produce sound at the same time that she pointed to the corresponding written letter. Thereby, a connection would emerge between the mother's mouth, the sound, and the letter. The mother, however, was first instructed in the textbooks by male experts in how to produce the sounds properly. Her body was meant to function as a medium for those male experts in their attempt to control the proper reproduction of language. As this scenario strikingly demonstrates, the mother tongue, coming out of a woman's mouth, was not just any language that a mother spoke, but rather the result of male ventriloquism. While this technique supported the ongoing standardization of the language, it also relied on the child's associating the written letter with the proximity and intimacy of the maternal body. As this historical account illustrates, the manufactured proximity between mother and language stages the fantasy behind the modern notion of the mother tongue, namely, that the mother tongue emanates from the mother's body. This notion indicates that within the monolingual paradigm, mother tongue is more than a metaphor. Instead, it constitutes a condensed narrative about origin and identity. Freud describes origin fantasies that take the shape of narratives in order to give rise to new subjects as family romances, hence why Yildiz is calling in this book the mother tongue expression a family romance. In these family romances, Gilles says, children reimagine parents in a grandiose manner in order to deflect their growing sense of the parents' ordinariness. Using this basic structure, I propose to read the modern notion of mother tongue as a linguistic family romance. This linguistic family romance helps to fantasize a bodily as well as familiar grounding in language that does not exist, say, in Schleiermacher's image of language as changeable horses strapped to a carriage. At the same time, this model offers a blueprint for tracing the emergence of possible alternative family romances that produce different conceptions of the relationship between languages and subjects and the origins of their effective ties. As we will see, the key elements of this linguistic family romance, namely affect, gender, and kinship, tied to a story of origin and identity, reappear in numerous texts, albeit in altered form. The notion of the unique mother insists on one predetermined and socially sanctioned language as a single locus of affect and attachment, and thus attempts to obscure the possibility that languages other than the first or even primary one can take on emotional meaning. However, despite these strictures, different languages can and do elicit heterogeneous affective investments and emotional reactions. In fact, as psychoanalyst Jacqueline Amati-Mella and her colleagues note, new languages can open up new intellectual and affective pathways. Such a notion differs from presumptions that the mother tongue is always the language of emotion and subsequent languages are merely languages of distance and detachment.
Second, children do not always inherit their parents' language or languages, particularly if within a couple its members do not have the same first language.
So if we go to the volume of Louis-Jean Calvet, Towards an Ecology of World Languages, we find a very interesting reflection on the idea of mother tongue. So on page 157, it says, thus in Senegal, a survey has brought out the way the children of linguistically mixed couples most often inherited Wolof, the dominant language, whether this was the father's language, the mother's, or the first language of neither of the parents. In Bamako, Mali, the children of mixed couples likewise inherit Bambara, also the dominant language in that milieu, while in Niamey, Niger, it is the two dominant languages, Hausa and Salma, that impose themselves in the same conditions. Another survey, this time in Kutiala, in the south of Mali, reveals the same phenomenon. Out of 188 of those surveyed who declared that Bambara was their first language, this was the father's language in 31 cases, the mother's in 35 cases, that of both parents in 48 cases, that of neither parent in 74 cases. To put it another way, the first language of those surveyed is the father's in 17.48% of cases, the mother's in 13.64% of cases, that of both parents in 41.95% of cases, and another language in 26.92% of cases. In all these examples, the language which can occasionally replace that of the parents as first language is thus that which dominates in the eco-linguistic niche, Wolof in Dakar, Bambara in Bamako or Kutiala, Hausa or Charma in Niamey. In other words, an African language in each case, an indigenous dominant language with the function of a vehicular language, one that is powerful enough to impose itself even within families.
Third, sometimes the dominant language in the milieu ends up imposing itself.
So here Calvet says, in Libreville, Gabon, the situation is slightly different but produces a similar result. The absence of an African vehicular language here confers on French a status that it enjoys nowhere else in Africa. In marketplaces, for instance, French predominates over Fang and Punu, whereas all the surveys carried out in the marketplaces of other African capitals show that it is practically absent from them. It is thus an exogenous language that fulfills the function of a vehicular language, a function that is performed elsewhere by an African language. Now, in mixed couples, this exogenous language plays the same role as a dominant endogenous language in the situations mentioned above. Here, the children of mixed couples inherit in 43% of the cases the language of their mother, in 16% that of their father, in 9% of cases both parental languages, and in 32% of cases French. The children of linguistically homogeneous couples inherit the language of their parents in 82% of cases and French in 18%. It is clear that French benefits from the existence of mixed couples and imposes itself to a significant degree when the couple is linguistically homogeneous. In other words, in Libreville, it is the dominant language in the milieu and plays the same role as African vehicular languages elsewhere. Its intrusion in the system of transmission is part of the change in the overall situation.
Fourth, in the case of speakers in a situation of migration, to what extent do they transmit their language to their children?
And here Calvet says, a survey carried out by the Institut National de la Statistique et des Études Économiques, the French National Institute of Statistics and Economic Studies, together with the Institut National d'Études Démographiques, the French National Institute of Demographic Studies, provides us with some interesting details on this issue. Starting with two questions. In which language or dialect did your parents usually talk to you when you were children? And what language or dialect do you usually speak to your children? The survey brings out the fact that only a third of those people surveyed whose parents did not speak French do not in turn speak French to their children. Spanish will thus in 2 generations have lost 80% of its speakers in migrant families, African languages 75%, Arabic 50%, etc. More recently, a study carried out by Fabien Leconte on the second generation of African migrants in the region of Rouen, where there is the greatest number of African migrants outside the Paris region, gives us additional information on the same point. In families from the Congo, for instance, children address their parents in French in 80% of cases, while their mothers speak to them in Lingala, 18%, in French, 32%, in both languages, 14%, or in a mixture of the two, 36%. We find the same situation with different percentages in other groups. Senegalese children speak to their parents in French, 56% of cases, Wolof, 33%, or a mixture of the two languages in the case of the Wolofs, with Pulaar and Soninke resisting the competition more effectively. These are average figures, since the situation varies depending on the parent's degree of competence in French. Indeed, Fabien Leconte shows that the use of this language is in direct proportion to their schooling. The longer they have stayed on at school, the more they address their children in French. And so, in conclusion, Calvet says the following: the notion of mother tongue is thus a mixture of myth and ideology. The family is not necessarily the place where languages are transmitted, and sometimes we observe breaks in transmission, often translated by a change of language, with children acquiring as first language the one that dominates in their milieu. So thank you so much for making it to the end of this video. I hope you found the content interesting. Don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone else who might find it insightful. And as always, thanks for watching.